I need some better storage in my shop, so let's build some cabinets. First off, I'm going to rough break down this sheet of plywood into two large panels that I can more easily manipulate on my table saw. So here I'm measuring out a piece that's going to turn into the bottom of the cabinet. Make sure I have a nice straight mark, and then I'm going to use my track saw to cut it down to a manageable size. It's always good to make sure that the edges you're referencing on are square to each other. You kind of assume they are on a piece of plywood, but that can be a dangerous assumption when, like me, you bought your plywood somewhere like Home Depot, so I always like to double check. Now I cut over it, but it's a good idea when you set up your track for your track saw to make sure it's square with the cut you're trying to make. So I use the square, you can see it over there to the side. Now I'm setting the depth of the blade to make sure that I cut through the board without cutting into my workbench. Underneath this piece of plywood, I have a bunch of pieces of scrap wood that are all the same thickness, holding the board up so I don't mess up my workbench, as long as I set the depth properly. One of the benefits to using a track saw is being able to use dust collection. Unfortunately, this is the first night I ever used this track saw, and I hadn't figured out my dust collection yet. I was just doing this as a test cut to make sure the track saw worked and I was able to use it the way I thought. So this is my first ever time using a track saw. The next day I figured out the dust collection and came back out to cut out another panel. This panel is going to actually be both sides. They can both fit into the width of one sheet of plywood, so I'm going to cut out one piece that's small enough to then run through the table saw. Now for the bottom piece, it's a little bit too wide to run through my table saw. I was making these cabinets 36 inches wide, and my table saw only cuts a maximum width of 30 inches. So I decided to do this with the track saw just so I wouldn't have to figure out how much to cut off or something like that. There are ways you could do it on a table saw, but with the track saw already out, I figured this was just easier. And then I spun up the table saw and start cutting out the side panels. Now, one thing I don't show here is I actually kept the fence at this same setting because this is cutting out the depth of the sides, and the depth of the sides are the exact same as the depth of the bottom, which I also cut while I was cutting these. And then I cut both sides to length once they're cut to depth. This means this panel is now at its final dimensions. And I use a 1/2 inch sheet of plywood to get a rough depth set. Here, I'm cutting a groove in the side panel here. What this groove is going to be is the start of a dado that I'm going to be cutting to recess the bottom into the side panel. Give it kind of a half lap instead of half lap. Also, I guess it's more of a rabbit because it's right at the end of the board. I'm bad with these terms. Now I'm just checking with the bottom itself to make sure that the cut is going to be at the right position to overlap with the bottom properly. So we have a nice flush sidewall and bottom. Once I'm satisfied with the cut, I'm going to take the other side and make a first pass as well. This is setting the indication. I don't have a dado stack. This would be much easier with the dado stack, so I have to do multiple passes with a regular blade. So what I do is I cut as far deep into the piece as I can, kind of making a line of where I'm going to cut to. Then I use the sacrificial piece on the fence so that I can get right up next to the blade, and I'll make a cut, slowly move it, make another cut, and just walk cuts out to that line that I made. This can be a little bit tedious, and I find I have an alternate tooth bevel blade, so I tend to move it over a 1/16 of an inch roughly per cut rather than the full width of the blade. This means, there's a little bit of overlap, so the cut comes out a little bit smoother. You don't have to do as much cleanup, but eventually you'll get exactly what you want. Once those dados are done, I also need to cut a groove into the back of the bottom and sides to hold a 1/4 inch piece of plywood I'm going to drop in to make kind of a back wall. So I'm going to run all three of these through at the same time so that the dimensions are exact, and then as I go, I'm going to test with a piece of 1/4 inch scrap to see exactly when I fit. I'm going to kind of creep up on it. This isn't a science, it's more of an art. So once I get that done, I'm going to start cutting out stretchers. These are going to go 2 across the back and 2 across the top to stop the sides from wobbling, support everything a little bit. I cut them all to length at once, and then I cut this panel I've cut into 2-inch strips. Now I find, rather than trying to do math and figure this out, I actually skipped over a part. I clamp up the cabinet without these stretchers first and figure out the distance by measuring once everything's clamped together. They should be the distance between your 2 inner walls of the cabinet. And I just attach these with pocket holes. You could do some fancier joinery, but these are just cabinets for my garage, so pocket holes are going to be quick and easy. Using a box from a failed attempt at making a drawer for an earlier cabinet, I'm just going to prop this up so that I can get clamps all around it on all sides and try and clamp this thing together. These are some nice little right angle clamps. If you don't need these for previous builds before I had these clamps, what you can do is use I use my speed square sometimes and just regular small clamps to hold the sides together and hold them at 90 degrees. If you don't have a speed square or you need more than one and you don't have more than one, I've also taken scrap pieces of wood and made sure I cut them so that all the sides are perfectly perpendicular to each other, and then you can clamp that and use that to hold them in place. But these are pretty handy. Now I'm test fitting that back panel. You'll notice it's a little bit long. I forgot to film cutting it shorter. I cut all the back panels when I made the first cabinet that I actually forgot to film. And then I had to change some of the dimensions, so all the back panels were a little bit long. So I didn't show myself cutting any of the back panel, but you can see it there off to the side. Now I start gluing up. You'll notice as I do, I use a piece of scrap 1/4 inch plywood to align the grooves at the back so that I know when this sets up, the back panel will be able to slide down the sides and into that bottom groove. And here again, I slide it over. And I do this before I put in those angled clamps because the angled clamps have a pin that sticks through and would get in the way if I put the pin through before I put that back piece on, unless I was super careful. Now I'm using these parallel clamps. These are fairly new to me. I couldn't get them to quite reach with that block I had under it, so I'm holding them up. That probably loses some of the perfectly parallel flat surface benefits you get, but it's holding this together. I think it's good enough. I'm going to throw in the stretchers with some pocket hole screws. I only show myself throwing in this one, but trust me, I put in all 4. 2 on the back and then 2 across the top. The ones in the back can also be used to mount this to the wall, and the ones on the top can also hold on the countertop. And now it's time to make a box to sit this on. It's going to form kind of like the kick plate. There's probably a name for it. I just always refer to it as the kick plate box. So I'm going to cut out 2 strips, or 3 strips actually, I think. Then I'm going to bring this over to the cabinet carcass and just use the width of the cabinet carcass to figure out how long to cut the front and back of the kick plate box. The sides don't need to really align with anything because I'll align the back of the box with the back of the cabinet, and the front will be recessed a little bit to give your feet a place to go. And then I'll bring it over to the miter saw and cut it. Once I cut one, I can use that first one to template out the second one. Then I'm going to measure out and cut the side pieces, and again, I'll measure one, cut it, and then I just use that one to determine the size of the other one. And then again, these are just for my garage, so I'm just throwing in some pocket holes. I'm going to put pocket holes in each end to connect the box, and also a couple pocket holes down one side, and this will join it to the cabinet itself. And then on the front and back pieces, I just need to do along one edge. And I mock it all up. Look how fast I'm going. Don't worry, I eventually do notice that the far end is upside down. I glue it up, let it sit, and throw in some pocket hole screws. I'm going to run some glue around the edge to hold it to the cabinet. And align it with the back edge and sides of that cabinet. Once it's pretty good, I'm going to screw it down. Now you'll notice it shifted a little bit. It's not perfectly flush on all sides, but again, garage cabinets, good enough. Once the cabinet's done, I need to make a face frame. I've got a lot of this rough sawn red oak, so that's what I've been using for this. First, I'm going to break the pieces down into more manageable sizes, a little bit bigger than the final dimensions, over on my miter saw. With boards this long, it's really important to make sure you're properly supporting the wood as you're cutting it, so you're not going to have things go flying all over the place as you cut it. Now, I don't have a joiner, so what I do is I run the board through my planer with this nifty little sled. So you basically shim out all of the wobble from the board and glue it down. I think I have another video where I kind of explain this a little bit. This is a more dramatic example because this wood is so rough. But you'll see in a moment how beautiful it cleans up when you put it through the planer. And it only takes a couple passes to start looking great. This is going to give you one perfectly flat side. If you don't shim it out, what happens is the rollers in the planer will push all of the warps and twists out of the board, and it'll thin it, but it won't actually flatten it. So after a few passes, the board gets flatter and flatter till it's good to go. Look how much cleaner that looks. That's beautiful. And then once you have one flat side, you can put that side down on the planer bed and flatten the other side. And then run it through. I tend to alternate back and forth until you get it down to the thickness you want. Now that I have my track saw, I figured it would be a good way to get one nice straight edge that's close enough to 90 degrees to the flat side that I just milled up. So that's what I'm going to do here. It's going to be a lot faster than the ways I've done it previously. You can go see my other YouTube video where I show how I made a nightstand. You can see my old method of doing it on the table saw. This worked well enough for this. thing to note here, these boards weren't wide enough to support the track saw on their own, so I would use 2 boards beside each other to make sure it was properly supported. And then, with that straight cut edge from the track saw up against the fence, I ripped these into 2-inch wide pieces because I'm making 2-inch wide face frames. Normally, I wouldn't recommend red oak for this type of work. A lot of people would use something like poplar, especially because I'm going to be painting these cabinets, but I happen to have got a really good deal from a local sawmill that was closing down and trying to liquidate a lot of red oak, so I'm using red oak. Sometimes you just got to use what you have. And then using my table saw fence and a piece of scrap wood to create a stop block, I set up my crosscut sled to cut those pieces down to their final lengths. You'll notice I'm using that scrap wood on the end. That's because when you're using something like a crosscut sled, it's easy if you put a stop. If you have a stationary stop in a moving piece of wood, it's good to have the wood come off of that stationary stop as it moves forward so it doesn't drag and get caught, or it could get flung by the blade more easily. So it's safe to have the stop just there to locate the cut before you slide it through the blade. And then again, for these face frame pieces, just going to throw in some pocket holes. This is where it would probably make a bigger difference to get into fancier joinery, but because these are going to be painted, and once again, just for the garage, pocket holes will be perfectly fine and hold it together well. And I'm going to go through and make sure to square up all these edges, glue everything together, clamp it up, and throw in some screws. The biggest downside to using pocket holes is they can tend to pull your wood out of alignment if you don't have it clamped up really well. So I like to clamp those pieces together with 90 degrees, and then you'll notice I also put a clamp that holds the 2 surfaces flush. You can see one right there. That stops them from drifting and becoming out of flush. If they're a little bit off, you can plane them, you can sand them, you can make it work, but it's best to try and keep them as close as possible. That's enough of that. You get the picture. So to attach it to the cabinet carcass, I'm going to run some glue around the front face of the carcass. Then I take the face frame. You'll notice this one's set up just for 2 doors. You can see a cabinet in the background that has drawers on it as well. That's what I originally wanted for this, but unfortunately there was a huge back order on drawer slides, and rather than wait for them, I figured I'd just make one with 2 doors. I can go back later and add in some cross braces and put in some drawers on the upper part, redo the doors if I really want them, but 2 doors in a cabinet will make much nicer than no cabinet whatsoever. Then I'm going to take a brad nailer and just go around and put a whole bunch of nails in just to make sure it stays in place. This is probably a little overkill. I'm still not quite sure how many of these things I need to be putting in here. I put in a lot, but this is definitely not going anywhere, except maybe off that stand that I'm using to support it. Now it's time to make the doors. So we'll skip ahead the milling process. I've cut down pieces of wood pretty much the same way I did for the face frame. They're 2 inches thick, or 2 inches wide, 3/4 of an inch thick, and now I'm cutting a 1/4 inch groove in them. To do this, I set the blade at the height I wanted the groove to be, and the fence a 1/4 inch away. So running it through on one side, flipping it, running it through again. That should give me a 1/4 inch gap centered on the 3/4 inch piece of wood if I did my math correctly. And then using a stop block for are these the rails, the stiles? The horizontal ones. I can never remember what they're called. I'm cutting tenons into these. I did this by setting the blade depth to about 1/4 inch and using that stop block to allow me to make shallow passes from the edge of the board until it hits the stop block, and that'll give me a tenon long enough to fit in the groove cut into the vertical pieces of the door. Again, this is another process that would be a lot easier with the dado stack. I have one now at the time of recording the voiceover, but when I was filming, I didn't have one. So it'll make things a lot easier, but for now, this is the best I could do. Now I'm taking a 1/2 inch thick piece of plywood to make the door faces. These are going to be the panels that fit in those frames for the doors. I use a 1/2 inch thick, which I think is fairly common when you're making 3/4 inch thick doors. This way it can have a 1/4 inch recess on the front, but be flush on the back. I think it just ends up being cleaner. That's how I do my drawer faces too. With drawer faces, it makes a little bit more sense because that gives you a flush mounting point. It's not really needed for the doors, but that's just how I do them. Once I have the panel a little bit bigger than the final dimension I need, I sit and adjust the blade until I have a tongue cut on the end of the blade that'll fit into the groove for the door frames. And then starting with the blade as close to my sacrificial fence as possible, cut all the edges of all the panels, rotating them around, move the fence over a little bit, and keep doing that until I have a rabbet around the entire outside of the panel that's big enough to fit into all the grooves for the door frame. Once that's good to go, I just start gluing everything up, putting it all together. And here you can see the back side of the door is up, and you can see it's kind of flush the entire way across. There's no recessed part for the panel, but you will see in a minute that it does have a recessed side on the other side there. Then I use the good old pencil scribble trick to start sanding. Sand away. Now I know this is everyone's favorite part of watching a build video, is just watching me move my sander around all over the place, but I'm going to go ahead and skip me doing this same exact process for the entire face frame of the cabinet and just start showing you how I attach the door hardware. So I use this handy little Kreg jig. This is to make a little recessed pocket that the door hinges can fit into. My favorite part about this is it even gives you a little spacer to use this little tiny drill bit, put 2 pilot holes so you can sink in the screws that secure the hinge in place, and it's perfectly aligned every time. Once the doors are good and ready, I'm going to take my sawhorses here, and I'm sinking 3 screws into each sawhorse. The idea here is to try and give me a place I can lay down the doors as I'm painting them, where they'll only touch 3 screws. The reason I chose 3 screws is because with 3 points of contact, you can have a stable platform without needing to worry about a wobble. It's kind of like a 3-legged stool. There is still, of course, some wobble. You got to be careful when you're doing it, but this ended up working out surprisingly well. I think this is going to be my method for painting these going forward until I get a better way of supporting this stuff. Unfortunately for you guys, I forgot to film myself priming these, so you'll have to settle for me putting on the first coat of paint. you'll notice the cabinet in the background, I didn't paint the sides because I thought, you know what, it'll have cabinets on either side. I've regretted it ever since. So I didn't do this on this one. I painted the whole thing. Now that I'm done painting, I'm going to take a utility knife and scrape out any globs of paint that are blocking up that hole and put on the hinges. They might have gone on a little bit easier if I had put the hinges on before I painted, but the hammer makes that a non-issue. So now I'm measuring out to get even spacing for both hinges, trying to figure out some math, trying to figure out exactly where I want these, put them right in the middle, trying to line everything else up, but they just weren't cooperating. My mind wasn't working right. I was missing something, still not sure exactly what the issue was. Eventually, I gave up on trying to line them up and measure it out properly, and instead, I spaced out the cabinet and just went inside and screwed them in place. Gonna screw in some pilot holes so the screws don't split the wood. Once I have one in place, it's easier to line up the other one, so I'll get that one done. Once I have both doors on, I come over and measure a set distance down from the top to figure out where I want to put the door handles. Now, when selecting door handles for your garage cabinets, it's very important to spend a lot of time finding the perfect cheapest one you can find at Home Depot. That's exactly what I did here. Look at those beauties. I'll put them on hand tight and then take a little screwdriver and snug them up. You don't need to go too crazy with these things. And then all I have to do is adjust the soft close on these hinges. There's 3 settings on each, and you just got to find the right balance to make it so it'll close softly without slamming, but also won't take forever to close. After a whole bunch of trial and error, I think I got it. Right here. And there you have it. Some beautiful garage cabinets.